On June 30th, 1956, a horrific accident occurred over the Grand Canyon. A TWA super constellation collided with a United Airlines DC-7, killing 128 people, which was the worst airline accident up to that time. That accident motivated the American people and Congress to invest in an entirely new system of air traffic control based around radar. This technology utilized an innovation that occurred during World War II to locate and separate enemy and allied aircraft. This used what were known as transponders to ping back the radar signals that were reaching the aircraft. This required a massive investment in new infrastructure and technology. And unfortunately, it took most of the 1960s and a whole series of additional accidents to get it fully implemented. At the beginning of the 21st century, an entirely new system has come into play that's every bit as significant as what happened in the 1950s and 60s. And this is a system that uses satellite positioning along with broadcast systems that provide real-time data across the globe. This now allows aircraft to be tracked anywhere on the planet in real time. This is a significant system, but it also requires the same massive investment in technology and infrastructure that occurred in the middle of the 20th century.
Let's face it, pilots need help. There's an incredible array of instruments and equipment on board the aircraft to help the pilot maintain safe flight. But a lot of the help that a pilot needs comes from an array of people and services on the ground. Some of the help even comes from space. There are two main ways that those on the ground can be of assistance to pilots. The first is making sure that the aircraft don't collide with one another or with the ground. The second role is to help pilots find their way, successfully navigating to the desired destination. In the U.S., both functions are provided by the Federal Aviation Administration, which was formed in 1958 after a tragic mid-air collision of two commercial airliners over the Grand Canyon on June 30th, 1956. Similar systems have come into place around the world, but to keep the overall picture in view, I'll focus only on the U.S. system in this lecture. The purpose of air traffic control is all about ensuring the separation between aircraft for safety of flight. Air traffic controllers issue instructions to aircraft, telling pilots which direction to fly, whether to climb, descend, or remain level at a specific altitude, and in some cases, what speed to fly. They're responsible for controlling an aircraft's 4D trajectory, latitude, longitude, altitude, and speed. In the U.S., all of this takes place in airspace across the country, from the highly congested airspace on the eastern corridor of the U.S. to the wide-open, relatively sparse air traffic environment of the western U.S. It's an amazing choreographed ballet to manage all of these aircraft and ensure safety of flight. And the air traffic in the United States is a highly dynamic system, with concentrations of air traffic shifting to different geographical locations depending on the time of day. For example, in the late evening, there's a strong push of transatlantic flights departing from the eastern cities in the U.S. As the night progresses, there is little traffic, save for an eastward slew of red-eye flights traveling overnight from the west coast. As dawn breaks, traffic bursts from hub cities in the east, first from hub cities linked to package companies like Memphis for FedEx or Louisville for UPS. Then, at the beginning of the workday, traffic bursts from the east coast cities, while the West remains quiet. Soon enough, the entire U.S. is swarming like a beehive of traffic, with a peak of between 5,000 and 10,000 aircraft in the air at a given moment. So it takes a lot of work from ATC to keep all of these planes moving. Let's pause for a moment to listen in on some typical ATC communications. You'll hear a cadence to the radio communications that is very rapid and abbreviated. Also, there's a rhythm of call and response, like a dance between the pilots and the New York approach controller. What you hear are instructions for changes in the direction of flight called heading, changes in altitude, and changes in speed. When the controller starts a transmission, he or she uses the call sign of the aircraft, which is often the flight number or sometimes the tail number. In the transmission you're about to hear, the controller starts off by calling JetBlue Flight 224, telling them to descend down to an altitude of 13,000 feet and hold that altitude once they arrive there. But instead of saying 13,000, a controller will say 13,000, since that's easier to hear correctly over the radio. Well, let's listen.
JetBlue 224, descend and maintain 13,000, then speed 210.
13,000 and then 210 speed. JetBlue 224.
At the end of the transmission, his instruction, then speed 210, means that the pilots need to slow their aircraft down to a speed of 210 knots after they've reached an altitude of 13,000 feet. The speed reduction is to help with aircraft spacing and to get the pilots under the FAA-mandated speed limit of 250 knots for safety at altitudes below 10,000 feet. After the approach controller issues the instructions, the pilot reads back the most critical elements to confirm receipt of the transmission and to ensure that the details are correct. Each aircraft uses their call sign, but the controller owns the frequency and doesn't have to identify. Also, notice that both the pilots and the controller emit any units. In the US and much of the world, it's understood that altitudes are reported in feet and speeds are reported in knots, which are nautical miles per hour. Now, in the air transportation system, there's a whole network of controllers working together to keep things moving. For example, on a typical flight from New York to Chicago, a pilot at the gate may talk first with clearance delivery, where the specific routing of flight is conveyed to the pilot. Then, the pilot calls up ground control and gets clearance to taxi, with a series of instructions of the exact taxiway route to follow and clearance for runway crossings. As the pilot reaches the end of the runway, a handoff is made to the control tower, which clears the aircraft for takeoff. Then, just moments after the aircraft leaves the ground, the tower hands the plane off to departure control. This controller gets the aircraft up and away from the airfield. And then, the flight may be handed off through other controllers, all in the same radar room as they cover different sectors of the airspace. Finally, as the aircraft climbs to higher altitude, control of the flight is handed off to an Air Route Traffic Control Center, which has management of a fairly broad swath of the country. Our notional flight from New York to Chicago would pass through New York Center, Cleveland Center, and Chicago Center, all with several controllers working various sectors within each center, before being handed off to Chicago Approach Control. At this point, the sequence of control handoffs is reversed until the aircraft lands and taxis up to the gate. All told, one flight could be worked by a team of dozens of controllers, all handing off responsibility and typically with changes of the radio frequency each time. Now, the baseline for air traffic control is safety of flight. Their number one job is to keep the aircraft from running into one another. But when they're issuing rapid-fire instructions to one aircraft after another, it's clear that there is another important responsibility that they have. They need to work as many airplanes through as possible. This push for efficiency even has a colloquial term for it: slam and jam. The controllers want to get as many aircraft through at a time and have little patience with those who clog up the system. The eastern metropolitan areas of the U.S., Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, are a highly congested environment, due not just to the number of planes, but also the need to maintain the required separation between planes. In fact, things go at their smoothest when everyone is going at about the same speed and behaving in a predictable manner. Things get much more challenging when aircraft are flying at different speeds. For example, one time I was on approach into Cleveland Hopkins International Airport in a little Cessna flying at 100 knots. The air traffic controller, in a somewhat exasperated and snarky tone, advised the commercial airliner barreling down on my tail at 200 knots, "Hey, there's a plane in front of you going half your speed. Slow to 170. The most dramatic disruption to aircraft, of course, was on September 11th, 2001, when terrorists struck the U.S. air transport system. Shortly after the plane struck both towers of the World Trade Center, and the FAA realized that this was an emergency of epic proportions, they ordered a ground stop for all aircraft that would transit New York airspace, but had not yet taken off. This happened at 9:06 a.m., just 3 minutes after the second plane struck the South Tower. A short while later, just following the crash of the third aircraft into the Pentagon, the National Operations Manager of the FAA, Ben Sliney, issued an order at 9:42 a.m. that all traffic must be grounded immediately. This was the first time ever that the airspace had been completely cleared. Air traffic controllers scrambled to reroute the aircraft to the nearest destination, and within just a couple short hours, the airspace was eerily quiet. Over 3,000 flights landed in a very short period of time. By 12:16 p.m., the FAA reported that all craft told to land had done so, and by 12:30 p.m., only 50 aircraft were flying in the U.S. airspace. Air traffic controllers performed admirably in the face of this truly exceptional adversity. On a more routine basis, though, weather events, such as thunderstorms or blizzards, are the biggest culprit for disrupting air traffic control. For example, if there are strong wind gusts at a busy airport, such as Reagan National, an aircraft attempting to land might have to abort the landing and go around. Suddenly, this go-around gums up the works, since the controllers have to issue instructions to this aircraft and work it back into the flow. But then, if that happens to 2 or 3 aircraft in a row, the controllers are now working really hard to move airplanes around to accommodate the disruption. As a result, some aircraft may need to divert to other nearby airfields, since their fuel reserves are too low to tolerate long delays. So everyone starts to get edgy as people try to work together towards the common goal of getting planes to their destinations. I'll admit to being the cause of disruption to air traffic on more than one occasion. One example is the high-altitude balloon launch that we saw in the second lecture. It just so happens that our launch location for the balloon, in the middle of the oval on Ohio State's campus, is about 5 miles away from the John Glenn Columbus International Airport, right underneath the final approach path. Commercial airliners fly over the OSU Oval all day, every day. So we knew that it would be a bad idea to simply launch our balloon and merely hope that it wouldn't hit an airliner. We called up the Columbus Terminal Radar Approach Control, or this is called TRACON, or Approach Control for short. The friendly controllers there happily agreed to work with us to ensure a safe launch. But what I saw next was surprising. We waited to launch our balloon until the right moment, when Approach Control said things were okay. Then, after watching our balloon ascend up and away, we saw an airliner bearing down on the oval. Shortly before reaching the oval, the airliner made a bank to the left and flew around the oval, turning back on the final approach course after clearing the oval. I was truly impressed by the controller's precision. Somehow, that was a powerful feeling, to recognize that an airliner full of 100 or so passengers was vectored out of the way for our balloon. Now, the level of precision exhibited by the air traffic controller and the pilot raises an interesting question. How does the controller know exactly where the aircraft is? Well, we recognize that air traffic controllers use radar to see where the aircraft are located, but let's look at surveillance systems, as they are called, in more detail. These systems include primary radar, secondary surveillance radar, and a relatively new protocol called ADS-B. Radar is based on the transmission of a steered microwave signal, formed into a narrow beam by a parabolic dish in order to obtain high spatial resolution. The common airport surveillance radar emits 25 kilowatts of peak power between 2.7 and 2.9 gigahertz. Detection of objects within a 60-mile radius depends on reflection of the transmitted radio waves back to a receiver, where the delay time between pulse transmission and reception of the reflected signal indicates the distance to the target. With the direction of the dish swept at a rate of 12.5 revolutions per minute, the data feed can be updated at a rate of about once every 5 seconds. The raw signal returned by a radar system will indicate the relative bearing and distance to respective targets. Subsequent processing of the received signals reveals the 3D position and velocity of an aircraft, separating it from the noise sources and surrounding weather. Conventional ground-based radar systems can provide surveillance of the airspace as long as there is sufficient radar coverage of the airspace. However, this may become limited for very low-level flying, which is typically under the radar. Also, radar systems provide limited information on altitude. So, modern surveillance systems also have a secondary radar system, often co-located with the primary radar. The secondary radar antenna transmits a signal on 1090 MHz and interrogates a transponder on board the aircraft. In this way, the secondary radar system is more of a two-way participatory engagement. When interrogated, the aircraft's transponder transmits a unique identifier code and its altitude, which is determined from its pitot-static system. Now, the FAA has also mandated a new form of transponder called Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, or ADS-B for short. In the ADS-B system, aircraft make periodic digital broadcasts with their position, altitude, speed, and other identifying information. These position reports are transmitted by the aircraft on either the 1090 MHz transponder band or a separate frequency of 980 MHz. The critical difference here is that the position reports are initiated by the aircraft, broadcasting its position at regular intervals, as opposed to the ground-based stations initiating the exchange. The FAA has ground stations set up across the country, providing nearly 100% reception coverage of ADS-B data transmissions from aircraft. The ground stations take the position reports, amalgamate that with the radar return data, and rebroadcast that information along with other data streams such as near real-time weather data. The huge advantage of this setup is that all aircraft with an ADS-B receiver on board will be able to receive position reports from all other aircraft in the vicinity. This enables each pilot to have a virtual radar scope in his or her own cockpit, which greatly enhances situational awareness of other aircraft in the area. I've personally benefited from this feature on many occasions. For example, one time I was flying along at 4,500 feet from Columbus, Ohio to Kalamazoo, Michigan. Suddenly, my onboard avionics reported, "Traffic, traffic." It was only after I received the traffic alert on my aircraft that I saw the other airplane climbing on a collision course with my flight path. I was able to make an evasive maneuver with plenty of time to spare, thanks to that traffic alert. This is exactly the benefit that the FAA hopes to gain through the use of ADS-B equipment. Now, most of the time when I fly, I'm in contact with an air traffic controller throughout the flight. This gives the added level of safety of having someone watching my progress and alerting me to other traffic in the area. Plus, the controller will help me stay out of trouble by vectoring me to avoid traffic. When two aircraft start to get close to one another, it's the traffic controller's responsibility to maintain reasonably large spacing between the two airplanes in order to avoid a collision. This is due to inherent uncertainty in the position estimate displayed on the controller's screen, whether the data is from radar or from an aircraft's ADS-B transponder. If the controller wants to allow the aircraft to fly more closely to one another, at least one of the pilots must make visual identification of the other aircraft. The air traffic controller will facilitate this by telling a pilot, for example, "There's traffic at your 1 o'clock, westbound, 1,000 feet below, and climbing." This position report tells the pilot where to look, with 12 o'clock being directly ahead, so traffic at 1 o'clock will be just to the right of the nose, from the pilot's perspective. Now, it can be incredibly difficult to visually identify another small aircraft flying below. It can get lost in all the background clutter, such as trees or buildings. But aircraft flying above are a little easier to spot, depending on the direction of the sun. If a pilot is unable to visually identify the traffic, the air traffic controller has to keep the aircraft far enough apart such that there is a very low probability of a collision, and the responsibility for separation assurance rests with the controller. However, once a pilot indicates that traffic is in sight, the air traffic controller implicitly hands off responsibility for collision avoidance to the pilot, and closer spacing can be allowed. This dynamic is one reason why aircraft get backed up during poor weather conditions. It's not possible for aircraft to see one another, so larger separation distances must be maintained. Now, what are the separation requirements for aircraft under radar control? These spacings are based on the high speeds that aircraft fly and the uncertainty in the surveillance systems. There are also differences depending on which kind of airspace the two planes are in and the relative size of the planes. In general, aircraft must be separated by at least 1,000 feet vertically. Or if the vertical separation is not maintained, then the aircraft must be at least 5 nautical miles apart in en route airspace, or 3 nautical miles in terminal area airspace. Over the North Atlantic, however, there is no radar coverage between Newfoundland and Ireland. So air traffic controllers set aside slots, segmented spatially and temporally, funneling aircraft sequentially into a small number of tracks for the aircraft to flow over the unmonitored seas. Since there is no radar coverage over this part of the globe, the separation requirements are as high as about 60 nautical miles to ensure safety. Now, that might be safe, but clearly it's not efficient. It ends up causing aircraft to fly well off of the optimal Great Circle path, just because separation must be guaranteed. However, ADS-B has changed that dynamic. In an interesting twist, researchers found out that the ADS-B signals transmitted by the aircraft could actually be picked up by orbiting Iridium satellites. So real-time position information is now available to controllers, and the separation requirements are relaxed, allowing greater throughput of aircraft. Even though air traffic controllers do an amazing job of keeping aircraft separated, there are still instances where controllers make mistakes. In these situations, it's helpful to have some kind of backup system that will alert pilots to the presence of imminent danger. This is exactly what the Traffic Collision Avoidance System does, or TCAS for short. Operating independently of air traffic control, the TCAS system monitors the transponder signals of other aircraft. Each aircraft transmits an interrogation signal on 1030 MHz, and the transponders on other aircraft respond on 1090 MHz. Based on phase delays between the signals to determine distance and directional antennas to infer relative bearing, the TCAS system determines the location of other aircraft in the area and displays this information to the pilot. But here's the key function of TCAS. If two aircraft are on a collision course, there is little time to waste before conducting an emergency evasive maneuver. And if by chance both pilots decided to take the same action in the same direction, a collision would still occur. So the TCAS systems on the two aircraft actually coordinate with one another to issue complementary resolution advisories in both cockpits. One aircraft will receive an urgent indication of climb, climb, and the other aircraft will hear descend, descend. Pilots are expected to immediately comply with these instructions even if ATC is telling them to do something different. So there are a number of safety systems and ground support infrastructure to help pilots avoid a mid-air collision. But the other key thing that pilots need is to successfully navigate to their destination. This has led to the development of ground-based navigation aids. In our previous lecture, we discussed how early airmail pilots would sometimes get lost as they attempted to navigate by landmarks. Navigation by landmarks can work as long as the pilot is familiar with the terrain below. It can be surprising, though, how the aerial view can be dramatically different from what we are used to with our terrestrial view. So the first improvement on navigation by landmarks was to use dead reckoning, which requires a map, a compass, and a watch at a minimum. If the aircraft speed and heading are known, the pilot can determine how far the aircraft has flown in a particular direction. However, the big variable here is the winds. Any wind aloft will cause the aircraft to drift from the intended course and will also cause the ground speed of the aircraft to be different from the wind speed. For example, if the aircraft is flying in a 20 mile per hour headwind at a flight speed of 100 miles per hour, then its ground speed is only 80 miles per hour. In fact, it's entirely possible to fly an aircraft backwards. If a strong headwind of around 60 miles per hour exists at altitude, or on a windy day, a Cessna 172 in low-speed flight of 50 miles an hour would actually be flying backwards relative to the ground. Not very useful, but an interesting oddity. Since older aircraft have no direct way of measuring the wind speed, the dead reckoning navigation method can lead to substantial errors. Pilots can work around this by fusing together the dead reckoning and landmark navigation methods. The actual amount of time required to a particular landmark can be compared with predictions based on dead reckoning and used to update the calculations and determine a refined estimate of the winds aloft. Assuming that the winds are steady, this refined estimate can then be used to accurately navigate to the next waypoint by dead reckoning. Both of these navigation methods leave a lot to be desired, though. For example, if the pilot is flying over barren terrain that is devoid of any easily identifiable landmarks, or if the pilot is flying in or above the clouds, it can be very difficult to find one's way. This problem led to the development of ground-based navigation aids that work in conjunction with systems on board the aircraft. These navigation aids all rely on radio communications. There are several different system concepts out there. The first is a non-directional beacon, referred to as NDB. It's a simple radio transmitter positioned at a known location. The transmitter broadcasts a relatively low power signal, between 25 to 125 watts for shorter range systems, or 500 to 1000 watts for long range. The signal is amplitude modulated and broadcast on frequencies ranging from 190 to 530 kHz, which is just below the bottom edge of the AM broadcast band. The non-directional beacon, as its name implies, broadcasts its signal in an omnidirectional pattern. The aircraft, however, determines the relative bearing to the NDB by using a directional antenna. In the earliest configurations, this was a loop antenna that could be rotated. When the geometric plane of the loop is perpendicular to the station, the signals received by either side of the loop are canceled, and a null is found that indicates the direction to the station. A notable example of a simple NDB receiving antenna is the steerable loop antenna on Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra. You'll notice the large loop antenna mounted directly above the cockpit. More modern configurations of this system involve two small antennas with circuitry that compares the phase difference between received signals on the antennas to infer direction. These antenna configurations are much more compact and avoid the large drag of a loop antenna. NDB direction finding provides the relative bearing to the pilot. This is the direction to the NDB relative to the aircraft's direction of flight. Now, the relative bearing of the aircraft to the station is only somewhat useful. It does allow the aircraft to navigate from station to station by keeping the aircraft heading in the direction that the needle is pointing. However, a single NDB station doesn't really tell the pilot what the aircraft location is. Simultaneous transmissions from two different NDB stations are needed, and the pilot would then have to plot the relative bearing from each on a map and then find where the two bearings cross to indicate the aircraft position. This practice is known as radio triangulation, and the accuracy of the technique is somewhat limited, and the method is time-consuming. Another key limitation of navigation by NDB is the varying propagation characteristics of AM signals in that frequency range. The long-wave band is susceptible to dramatically different propagation distances between day and night, and thunderstorms are very disruptive to signal reception. So, transitioning into the 1930s and 1940s, another technique was developed in the very high frequency band, between 108 and 118 MHz. The VHF Omnidirectional Radio Range, or VOR, system has several advantages over NDBs. First, signals in the VHF range are much less susceptible to interference and the vagaries of radio propagation. Second, much of the system complexity is shifted to the ground station, so the aircraft-based system takes a more passive approach. And third, the orientation of the aircraft with respect to the ground station no longer matters. An aircraft infers its location by comparing phase differences between two signals emitted by the VOR station. The first signal transmitted by the VOR station is an omnidirectional, frequency-modulated reference signal. The second signal is swept around the full 360 degrees of azimuth by an electronically scanned array of highly directional antennas. As the output signal is rotated around the azimuth, the phase is proportionally increased, where each degree of azimuth results in another degree of phase delay relative to magnetic north. In the receiver on board the aircraft, the phase difference between both signals is compared and directly converted into a bearing from the station to the aircraft position, measured from magnetic north. The bearing is displayed on a gauge in the cockpit, where the pilot can dial in the desired bearing and a needle indicates whether the aircraft is to the left or the right of the set bearing. VOR stations quickly gained in popularity, leading to thousands of installations around the world for aircraft navigation. VORs provide precise information on the bearing between the station and the aircraft, but still do not provide a fix for the aircraft unless two separate VOR stations are simultaneously received and triangulated. The need for determining a precise aircraft fix is filled through distance measuring equipment, or DME. DME operates in the 960 to 1215 MHz band and is a system where the airborne equipment actively interrogates the ground-based hardware. It's basically a call and response system where the delay associated with the response can be converted into a line of sight distance. There are 126 separate channels available, with each channel capable of simultaneously handling multiple aircraft. This allows a single DME station to simultaneously handle hundreds of aircraft before losing signal. The aircraft DME equipment performs the interrogation by transmitting a string of pulse pairs. After the ground signal detects interrogation pulses from the aircraft, and after waiting for a fixed period of time, it responds with an equivalent pulse train. The aircraft detects the pulse pairs from the ground station and finds the transmission time between the aircraft and the ground station. This time is then converted to a distance by the speed of light, which is 1 nautical mile for each 12.36 microseconds. VOR and DME stations are often co-located, since the combination of the two pieces of information allows the pilot to precisely define the aircraft location. So, with this network of NDB, VOR, and DME stations, the FAA set up a routing structure. Aircraft could plan a flight from one destination to another based on these radio navigation aids that formed a complex, crisscrossing web of routes across the country, and would never have to see the ground to find their way. While air traffic control does an outstanding job of keeping aircraft moving safely and efficiently, there is always room for improvement. This has led to the FAA's investment in the Next Generation Air Transportation System, or NextGen for short. One NextGen enhancement that is improving safety involves a shift from radio communication, which is often garbled and unintelligible, to data exchange via secure texting services. Traditionally, a pilot has to manually write down route information from a transmission like this.
Jet 43 Boston Venture clears to the Vineyard via the Logan 1 departure. 359 degree radial, 35 DME, direct. Climb via the SID, squawk 5313.
And then the pilot has to manually feed that handwritten information back into the aircraft's avionics. So traditionally, information that is digital with the FAA gets transmitted over poor analog channels to the pilot, who then puts it back into digital form for the aircraft's flight management computer. Under NextGen, though, the information is transmitted digitally via texting-like service, and the data is then fed directly into the flight computer. This, of course, greatly reduces the risk of transcription and keying errors. The key cornerstone of NextGen is the shift from radar surveillance to ADS-B for primary coverage, and GPS navigation instead of land-based radio navigation aids. So this shift in technology under NextGen enables tighter spacing between aircraft, direct routing to the destination, fewer delays, and fuel savings for the airlines, all while providing an enhanced level of safety.